Hey, welcome to the Intentional Living Center again this month. Glad to be with you. I've been thinking a lot about this series that we started a month ago as we started to talk about intentional living and where it fits into the areas of our life. And this month, I want to talk a little bit about how intentional living can make a difference in your family and your family relationships. So, we're going to get back to the basics of what intentional living is and give you some really practical things for your family because we believe in the power of one thing. And there are really four pillars that we're going to talk about this month and next month. I'm going to spread them out over 2 months. This month on the family, and then next month making it a little more personal for you and for myself, just how we interact in life. But the four pillars that we talk about when we talk about the power of one thing, first of all, is expectations. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Secondly, about the power of communication. Those two things are essential if we're going to have the kind of family relationship that I think God intends for us to have. And then next month, we're going to focus on how do we establish goals for our life, and then ending with habits, which is such an important part of how we get along in the world. So let's begin by talking about expectations. First of all, recognizing as we think about the power of one thing, where the Apostle Paul says, he was reflecting on his own life. He says, "One thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind me, I choose to reach forward toward the goal that God has given me for the upward calling of my life in Jesus Christ." That's sort of my paraphrase of what you see and hear as you read from Philippians 3:13 and 14. And that leads us to that first of those four pillars that we want to talk about, which is the pillar of expectation. You know, I often say that an expectation that's not met always creates a disappointment in the life of a person. Expectations sometimes are realistic and sometimes they're not realistic. And one of the things that we need to do in our family is to establish clear expectations. I think of that as a parent. When you're a parent, if you don't have clear expectations for yourself and clear expectations for your children, then what happens is it goes from day to day. And I'll promise you, as a parent and working with parents over the years, that one of the reasons kids get angry is because they're not clear what the expectations are. All of us have a desire, a need to know what's expected of us. And when we have a clear expectation, that helps them and it helps us as a parent in our relationship with each other. And so the question is, what's a realistic expectation? I think for families, it's realistic to have manners. I think it's realistic to have respect. It's realistic to be faithful to one another and honest with each other. What's not realistic are the expectations that I'm going to have a perfect child, that my child has to measure up to some unrealistic expectation that I'm setting for them. And you may have grown up in that kind of a home, and especially those of you who were the firstborn in the family maybe had unrealistic expectations in your life established for you that you never felt like you could measure up to. And that can create all sorts of unrealistic thoughts about yourself and your identity and your own expectations for yourself. And so as we talk about expectations in the family and how intentional living works, I think it's important to see that expectations have to be clear. They need to be agreed on between mom and dad. They need to be communicated with the kids. They need to be realistic, and they need to be enforced. If an expectation is something that's important, then there should be the expectation that's going to be completed. For instance, maybe an expectation that kids are going to take care of their own room, clean up their own mess, be respectful in how they talk to each other. Maybe an expectation that, hey, we go to church every Sunday and the kids don't want to go. What do? You say, here's the car, let's get in, let's go. It's an expectation. And so when we have clear expectations and we follow through, we give the family a sense of security and predictability, two things that are desperately needed in this crazy world in which we're living today. So the first of these four pillars that we're talking about this month and next is understanding the power of expectations, remembering that an expectation minus the reality of life is always going to create disappointment. So if there's disappointment in your family, there's probably an expectation somewhere that either isn't well understood or unrealistic or being ignored. And so clarifying expectations is a really important part of an intentional family. Secondly, I want to talk about communication. You know, communication is the key, as one author said, to a healthy marriage, but it's also true for a healthy family. And one of the verses I often use in my conferences for couples is from Proverbs 25:11, where it says that a word aptly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. And that word aptly simply means it's the right word at the right time in that situation. And so often when a child and the family needs encouragement, we give them criticism. When they need instruction, maybe we just ignore it. And in the process, we're not communicating the way God intends for us in our family. And I wanted to take the rest of our brief time together this month and share with you something based on research that's been done in this format in terms of marriage. John Gottman is a professor and has spent thousands of hours talking to thousands of people. And as a result of that, he can predict with a certain element of certainty which couples are going to run into trouble and even lead to divorce. And he created a list of 5 things that are really powerful, or 7 things actually that are powerful when it comes to communication in marriage. And as I was reviewing these and sharing these in my conferences, I realized that these principles also work in our family life. And so I thought I'd share these from Dr. John Gottman that'll be helpful for us when we think about being intentional in our family. The first thing he found in his research is that if we nip a problem in the bud early, there's a less likely to have problems down the road. This is true in marriage. Half of all marriages will end in the first 7 or 8 years, and often it's because the problems are not addressed early on. And this is true in parenting as well. If you're having issues in your family, maybe there's a lack of communication, a lack of agreement. Sometimes what happens, problems get shoved under the rug. Disrespect gets shoved under the rug. And other kinds of things get ignored. And what happens is a problem will be progressive. Good behavior tends to be progressive. Bad behavior tends to be progressive as well. And so the first step in really developing a healthy style of communication in the family is to make sure if there's a problem that you deal with it early. Don't wait, deal with it early. Number 2, John Gottman finds that when we communicate in marriage, if we edit what we say, we're going to have a healthier marriage. I think that's true with our family as well. Things that we say, you ever say things that you wish you could take back? Maybe a word that's discouraging. Out of frustration, you say something that maybe didn't have the intention to hurt, but it landed as a hurt on that person. And so when we edit ourselves, which really means, I remind people the best thing to do is think twice and speak once. When we're clear about what we need to say and we say only that one thing, it's healthier and better for the family relationship. So seeking help early, editing what we say. And then number 3, Gottman finds in marriages that couples who are careful how they start a conversation and don't allow it to escalate will have a healthier marriage. And you know, there's lots of things in our marriage, in our family and our marriage, that we can do that can escalate a problem. And you start out with one conversation, and pretty soon you're on a totally different issue, unrelated, a lot of emotion, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. And so there's ways of beginning a conversation. Let me give you some ideas, a couple ideas. Number 1, if you have an issue with a son or daughter and you need to talk to them, maybe to sit down and say, honey, I love you, and I have something I need to share with you. Is it okay if I share that with you? You're asking for permission. 90% of the time, the kids are going to say, sure. They're giving you permission. They're feeling more in control, allowing you to share with them something that is important that needs to be said. Now, that's true in marriage as well. And so, starting that carefully and then beginning a conversation by pointing out the things that you really appreciate, the things that are going well, the things that you want to reinforce that will remind the child of how special they are, or your spouse how special they are. And then I wouldn't use the word but because that just discredits everything you've said. In the process, as you share these things, just turn to the topic. There is one thing, however, that I wanted to talk to you about, that I'm concerned about for us and for you, and be able to talk about it, leaving it open-ended for them to share back what they're experiencing, how they feel about it. I'll tell you, it's not easy. I know we can fire up with our emotions pretty quickly. And so when we soften the startup, that can be very healthy. So seeking help early, editing what we say, start softly. And then number 4, accept influence. It's interesting that he found in his research that a marriage succeeds to the extent that a husband can accept influence from his wife. And then I was thinking of that verse in Ephesians 5:21 that says that we should be mutually submissive one to another. And I think in our families, can we be open to the influence of our sons and daughters? Listen to them. Sometimes they have things that they want to say, or feelings or ideas that are going to be good. And I know as a dad, it's easy to say, I'm the dad, I'm in charge, I'm in control, I said it, and that's the way it's going to be. And when we do that, I think sometimes we miss the opportunity as a group, as a family, to really talk about things and sometimes even make better decisions, which really reminds us of the importance of having those family meetings and talking about those things. So accepting influence. Number 5 is really important when we talk about having an intentional family. If you're going to be intentional in your family, you have to maintain high standards. Gottman found in marriages that when couples tolerate bad behavior from themselves or from their spouse, it creates a problem in the marriage. And this is true in the family as well. And we go back to talking about expectations, right? A little bit ago. Establishing expectations about the standards in our family. What are things that are not acceptable in your family? Some things that would not be acceptable in our family is we don't use profanity. We don't tolerate God's name being used in vain. We don't lie to each other. We make sure that we tolerate good behavior when it comes to how we're going to say things and not be critical of each other in ways that hurt and damage. And if we have clear standards that are high in a family, I think we can help a family elevate to another level. We live in a culture today that seems to be dumbed down to the lowest common denominator in our culture. And those of us who are Christians in our family, to raise that bar to a higher standard of how we live and how we take care of the things that God gives us, and standards about our money and about our work and about our integrity, not about perfection. You don't hear me use that word in intentional living, but about the standards that we have. And they should be clear, and they should be reinforced, and they should be accountable, each of us, not only the kids, but us, because kids will see through it if the standards we set are not the standards that we keep ourselves. Number 6, learn to repair and exit an argument. It's interesting that John Gottman in his research on couples found that successful couples know how to exit an argument. And it reminds me of that little verse in Proverbs 18:19 that says, an offended brother is more unyielding than a fortified city, and disputes are like the barred gates of a citadel. Wow, what a word picture. And when we become offensive in a conversation, and here's what happens. When we get into a family dynamic, we're talking about something, and we force the person we love to take a position on something. And once a position is taken, then that person feels the need to defend that position, even if it's wrong, even if it's stupid. I mean, sometimes, come on, we've had conversations maybe with our teenagers or with our kids, and they've taken a position on something that is just foolishness, it's not right. But they've taken a position, they've heard it on TikTok, they've seen it, or they just believe it, and as a result, they try to defend something that's indefensible. And so when we have an argument, we have a disagreement, learning to exit an argument, how do we do that? maybe agree to disagree, maybe agree to come back and talk further a little bit later. Certainly as a Christian family, to agree that we're going to pray about this and seek God's wisdom. What could this be? It could be in any area of life. Now, I'm not suggesting, by the way, as a parent, that you're weak and weak need when it comes to having standards that you're going to set for your family. You need to do that. But when you have a disagreement or an argument, boy, you know, how you leave that argument is so critical. Some of you probably could report that you had an argument with somebody in your family. Maybe it was with an adult sibling many years ago, or with a parent who was long deceased. And something was said and it still sticks with you. And it created a divide, even though maybe you maintained a relationship. It was something that was continuing to be in that relationship. I can remember an older couple that I counseled with early on in my career, and they were well into their mid-60s or 70s. And at the end of their conversation, they weren't really communicating. I couldn't get a breakthrough for them to communicate. And finally, she turned to him and said, 25 years ago, this is what you said about my family, about my mother, and I've never forgiven you. For 25 years, they've had this low level of tension in their marriage, and that thing never got resolved. And if it was something they could have resolved 25 years earlier, think the difference it would have made in their life. Some of us in our family are still carrying things. To be able to sit down and ask for forgiveness, deal with forgiveness, to be a big enough person as a mom or dad to go to our kids when we're wrong and say, I was wrong, will you forgive me? That's a powerful thing. And then number 7, Gottman, in all of his research on what makes marriages, and I think families work well, he said, focus on the bright side. I thought that's interesting. In a happy marriage and in a happy family, listen to this, interesting. He found that at least 5 times more positive statements were made to each other than negative statements. And so every time we say something negative, we got to say something 5 times positive to build in to offset that negative statement. His research went on to say that the number one thing that destroys a marriage relationship will be an undercurrent of criticism. And you know, the verse tells us here that a cheerful heart is a good medicine, Proverbs 17:22. I think sometimes just having fun, being a fun family and having fun time together and being able to communicate and just enjoy each other, because the life is so serious today. And so these 7 things, if we do them intentionally, because one of the principles of intentional living is building habits. If we can make these 7 things a habit in our life, seeking help early, editing what we say before we say it, soften when we begin a conversation, to learn to accept influence from our family, from each other, to maintain high standards in our family, learn to repair and exit an argument, and then focus on the bright side. These 7 things are powerful in building your family and making intentional living a part of your relationship. You know, when we get together next month, I want to talk about that thing about building habits. What kind of habits do we have that'll be strengthening in our relationship and our family and make it a positive thing in our life? So we're going to be talking about that next month, as well as how do we establish goals, the power of goals in our family. I just want to say, as we're wrapping up here from the Intentional Living Studio, how much my wife Donna and I and our team, Stephen and Jennifer and the rest of the team, appreciate and respect the fact that you're supporting what we're doing. We're seeing people come to Christ. You know, I had a conference in Albuquerque just a few weeks ago, and we saw so many people stand to make a one-thing commitment for their marriage, and some who turned their life to Christ. We hear reports on our comment line every day from people who are saying, I get it. Figuring out what pleases Christ, making that decision, doing one thing every day, and then decluttering my life from those things that are holding me back. Those things are transformational in your family. And you know what? These principles work in your life as well. And so in the next month, I want to talk about these other 2 pillars. We've talked about communication and expectations. Next month, I want to talk about establishing goals, the power of goals, and the power of being able to communicate those goals as we get together next month. So I hope you'll join us. Thank you again for your support and for standing with us here at Intentional.